I'm a faculty at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. And for the past 11 years, I've had the tremendous privilege of both developing and then delivering a course called Reproductive Health Advocacy as part of my academic dossier. And now more than ever, we need reproductive health advocates. And so it's a wonderful part of the students' learning journey and graduate students as they're leaning into these topics in really meaningful ways. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to mention an enormous thank you to the UCLA Bixby Center for Population and Reproductive Health for hosting this important gathering. If you're not familiar with the Bixby Center, you should certainly commit to doing so. And a little bit about it, it was established in 2001 with a particular focus on training, fellowships, research, and outreach, such as lectures and conferences and other outreach around events like this. And the Bixby Center at UCLA is hosting this, but there are also Bixby Centers at UC Berkeley and at UCSF. So an enormous thank you to Dr. Paula Tavro and to Frankie Guerrera, who've been really pulling all of this together. And certainly it is both timely and absolutely necessary. So in my course, I like to say that advocacy is not a spectator sport. And I'll say that again, advocacy is not a spectator sport. And we learn more about more of our panelists, and we will be learning more from our panelists. But one of the first things you can do is to join the Bixby listserv for upcoming events. So in the chat, Frankie's going to drop a link for you to be able to just join that listserv and find out about other important events that you certainly are going to want to know about in the next few months. So joining me today are the following impressive panel, and I had a chance to gather with them a few weeks ago, and it made me so excited to jump into this content today. So each one of them I'm going to introduce briefly, just their name and where they are joining us from. And then once we get into an opportunity to hear from them, I'm going to give a brief intro about each of them. So let's start with Nakia Woods. Nakia is the project director from the California Coalition of Reproductive Freedom. We have Lisa Matsubara, who's the general counsel and vice president of policy for Planned Parenthood Affiliates of California. Joining us also is Jessica Pinckney, who's the executive director of Access Reproductive Justice. We have Onyemma Obiekea, the policy analyst for Black Women for Wellness and Action Project, and Shannon Olivieri Hovis, who's the director of NARAL Pro-Choice California. So while I have much to say about this topic, we want to hear from our panelists. And my role today is that of a facilitator. I'm going to ensure that we keep on time and that we field questions from all of you during the allotted time. So from a planning standpoint, our plan is to have each of the panelists speak for about 8 minutes or so about a question that I'm going to pose to them. And after roughly 45 to 50 minutes, we're going to open it up to questions from all of you. So I want you to start thinking about those questions that you want to ask and be dropping them in the chat. And as we get closer to our prepared remarks, then we're going to have a time to answer questions from all of you. Undoubtedly, of the people that are joining us, we have a range of expertise in reproductive health and abortion, and it's important that we make sure that we all have an understanding of where California has been on this issue as foundational knowledge. So the leaked memo of the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court opinion earlier this month may have evoked myriad emotions for all of you on this call. Anger, disbelief, frustration were commonly reported. And because the implication of what's at stake, of course, is significant, as our federal protections for all reproductive rights are in serious jeopardy. And fortunately, the group of panelists that are joining us anticipated this was a very real possibility. And they have been working both individually and collaboratively, exploring the implication for Californians and for those who will be coming to California seeking protections. They are strategic, forward thinkers who come to us with history, insight, guidance, and recommendations. So let's hear from them. Nakia, let's begin with you. So Nakia Woods is the director of the California Coalition for Reproductive Freedom. In addition to their role at CCRF, Nakia is an aspiring midwife, full spectrum birth worker, and a sex educator. Originally from San Diego, Nakia has been thriving in the Bay Area for over a decade. In their spare time, they love to take care of their plant daughter and son, Lily and Harry, and interact with all things Harry Potter, and constantly change their social media accounts from private to public and public to private, depending upon what needs to be shared. So Nakia, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm hoping you can start by just giving some perspective on What is California's history of abortion?
Sorry, I just like laughed at my own bio, which I guess is kind of cheesy, but I never read it out loud. So thank you all for having me. I'm gonna actually share my screen and do do a short PowerPoint for you all. So give me a second. And this is the part that always gets a little difficult, no matter how long we've been on Zoom. I never remember how to make my presentation screen. So give me 1 second. But before we get started, I did want to talk a little bit about the California Coalition for Reproductive Freedom, which I'm the director of. We are a coalition of over 40 organizations, which I believe most or all of the panelists are members of our coalition. And we really see ourselves as the glue that are really that's keeping all of the policy conversations, the social conversations that are that are in regards to reproductive freedom in California together. And I figured out how to share my screen. So bam, got that ready for us. So I'll make this short, about 8 minutes, so we can't get too deep. This is something that people get full degrees in and write full theses on. But I did want to give y'all a quick snapshot of California's history and our current situation with abortion. So just some context, things that most folks don't know. Abortion was actually not regulated in the United States until the 1880s, where we see the AMA, American Medical Association, being formed by mostly white men who said, you know what, we need to regulate abortion because we are doctors and that's what we need to do. After the 1880s, we see every state in the U.S. having abortion be completely illegal. From 1900 to the 1960s, it's not supposed to say 60, but 1960s, abortion was actually completely illegal in California. And in 1967, I believe is the year, there was a group of 9 physicians who were being sued. Sued for either performing abortions or recommending abortions for folks in California. Because of that case, we actually got a 1969 decision that declared that our laws on abortion were unconstitutional, and this was because of privacy and due process. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I think Lisa might be a lawyer on this call. So if you have more like legally type questions, you want to point them to Lisa. And then in 1973, we have the Roe v. Wade decision, which meant that no state could regulate abortion for folks in the first trimester. Something that's important to name, all these laws name women as the folks that are getting abortions. We know now that in 2022, just because you have a uterus does not mean that you are a woman. And so we are gender inclusive when we're talking about abortion. And that's why I'm wearing my Black Trans Lives Matter shirt, so that to remind y'all that when we're talking about abortion, we're not just talking about women. So even though abortion was considered legal in California in 1969, we still face various barriers. But the good thing is that California has always been a champion for abortion, not always, but in recent years have been a champion for abortion access. Some of those barriers are things like the Hyde Amendment that was passed in 1976, something that's still in effect. Basically, that prevents federal dollars, things like Medicaid, from getting dollars to provide dollars to folks that are seeking abortions. Something that's good for us in California is that we have decided to take on those costs in our Medi-Cal program. 2021 was the first year that the Hyde Amendment was not named in the federal budget. So we can give a shout out to Biden this one time. We also have the global gag rule, which doesn't necessarily impact folks that are in California, but it does block foreign organizations that receive U.S. health. Sorry, went back. There we go. Sorry, I was trying to move y'all's faces. But it does prevent organizations that receive U.S. health aid from providing information or referrals for abortions or advocating for abortion access. With the global gag rule, it's kind of hit or miss. It depends on who's in power at that time. So we have folks like Trump who said, yeah, we're going to use the global gag rule. We're going to expand it actually. But then we have folks like Obama who say, okay, we're not going to actually enforce the global gag rule. Some other barriers that we see in California that are important to mention are crisis pregnancy centers. Many people don't know what a crisis pregnancy center is. They don't know they exist. And these are really organizations that pose as that when you look on the internet, when you're looking up, hey, I want to get an abortion, these might be some of the first organizations that pop up, and they promote themselves as abortion providers. But when you come in, one of their main things is that they try to convince folks not to get abortions or point them in and do not provide accurate medical information. In California, in 2015, I believe, Title 10 made it or expanded, I guess that might be the right word. And it was the first state law in the nation that required all providers of pregnancy-related services to post information about reproductive health services that include abortion. So that really did a hit for crisis pregnancy centers who were not providing that information. And then access. One of the major barriers for abortion in California is the fact that we are a populous state. There are not enough abortion providers. And in rural areas, folks might not have access. We look at laws like AB 154, which expanded which expanded who could provide abortions, and that included certified nurse midwives, nurse practitioners, physician assistants. All those folks can actually provide and offer first trimester abortions. Right now, currently we have AB 1375 that's in the legislature that is looking to expand this and increase access to other residents. We also have access issues such as funding, and also, thinking about folks that live in rural areas, having to drive, stay overnight in spaces so that they can find an abortion provider. A special shout out to Access Reproductive Justice, who's on this call. Their director, Jessica, is on this call. They are the only abortion fund in California, and they help to appease some of those barriers, right? Getting funds for and rides for folks that don't live close to where abortion may be, giving rights to folks where an abortion provider may be far. So I get nervous and then my mouth just doesn't work. Something that's important for folks to know, abortion is and will continue to be legal in California, even with the Roe v. Wade decision. We hope for the best that it won't be overturned, but we are also realistic people, recognizing that we did get the leaked decision. A lot of Californians are afraid that they will not have access to abortion, and we want to make sure that y'all are not having that fear. Something that's important to name is that there are no restrictions on a person's right to choose an abortion in the United States. That includes things like waiting periods, age restrictions. It doesn't matter how old you are. If you are pregnant, you can get an abortion. You don't need parental consent, and you do not need your partner's consent. In other states, that is not the case. And then we have 13 FAB Council bills that are currently in the legislature. And I wanted to highlight 3 to keep your eye on. So we have AB 2223, and that would protect people from from basically being criminalized for having their abortion. And abortion and also pregnancy loss. We're talking about miscarriages, stillbirths, and things like that. And also protecting patients that have self-managed abortions. We have AB 1918, which I believe is not a FAB Council bill, but is something that is on our radar. And that would create a California Reproductive Health Services Corps to basically get more abortion providers in the state and train as many abortion providers as possible. It's great that abortion is legal in California, but when we don't have enough people that can perform those abortions, we still have lack of access. And then we have SB 1142, which would create a California Abortion Support Fund, which would provide grants to organizations like Access, like Black Women for Wellness, like CCRF, to provide logistical and direct support to people that are accessing abortion services in California. We know that abortion is being attacked right now, and we want to make sure that y'all know that in California, we are a reproductive freedom state. Whether you're choosing to have your baby or babies, put your baby or babies up for adoption, or choosing to have an abortion and terminate your pregnancy. We have amazing groups and organizations that are going to continue to fight and have been fighting since, the 70s, the 60s. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great.
I'm not.
Thank you so much, Nakia. Wonderful. Such a terrific and important background for everyone. And it provides the foundation for us to be able to continue to have this discussion. So thank you so much. And thank you for mentioning the gender inclusivity. Very much appreciate that. And let's keep that in mind, not only today on this call, but making sure that we're committing to inclusivity for all people that are experiencing reproductive injustices or justices that we want to protect. So Jessica, turning to you. I'd like to introduce Jessica Pinckney. She's the Executive Director of Access Reproductive Justice, a reproductive justice organization funding abortion, as was mentioned, and other reproductive healthcare. Jessica oversees the organization's work to combine direct services, community education, and policy advocacy to promote real reproductive options and access to quality healthcare for people in California. She's an avid reader, a newly found Peloton enthusiast, and a loving pet parent to 8-year-old American Bulldog Pit Bull mix Apollo. So Jessica, thank you so much. And if you could talk a little bit about what was the major impetus for getting the Future of Abortion Council, or the FAB Council, formed, and really talk a little bit about what's been happening in terms of spearheading this and driving this within California.
Sure. Thank you very much. Similarly to Nakia, never hear my bio be read out loud like that. And I'm now giggling. Yes, Access Reproductive Justice is thrilled to be one of the steering committee members of the Future of Abortion Council, which started last fall as we saw Senate Bill 8 go into effect in Texas, and as we prepared for the Supreme Court to hear oral arguments in Dobbs v. Jackson, which is the case before the Supreme Court right now, which is likely to overturn or severely gut Roe v. Wade. So the governor actually came to a number of advocates and explicitly requested that we put the Future of Abortion Council together to look at what abortion access already looked like in California and make recommendations to the administration and to the California legislature for what could be done to improve access to abortion in the state, knowing that this would all benefit folks in California. As Nakia mentioned, there are barriers to accessing care here in the state for Californians, and also knowing that we as a state who would ensure that abortion remained legal even if Roe v. Wade was overturned, was prepared to welcome an influx of folks from other states to California to access their abortion care. So throughout the fall, we convened over 40 organizations, over 100 individuals in those from those organizations and independent entities to develop recommendations. And in early December, we actually released a report with 45 recommendations to the legislature and the governor for action that could be taken to ensure that California truly is a reproductive freedom state, and we're eliminating as many barriers to accessing care as possible. There is a great website I will direct you all to. It's cafabcouncil.org. You can put that in the chat also. And that is where all of the information about the FAB Council lives. You can access the full report there that has all of the recommendations that were made. There's a great checklist that matches the recommendations to the pieces of legislation that are currently moving through the legislature, as well as executive action that may have been taken by the governor, the attorney general, and others. So we released that report in December. And when the legislature came into session here in California in January. The California Women's Caucus really spearheaded introducing the 13 bills that Nakia mentioned. And Lisa will be diving into more of that in her presentation. But these bills really cover the multitude of issues that we kind of discovered or already knew about and brought attention to through our Future of Abortion Council convenings last fall. They fall into about 5 buckets, which is services, coverage, and reimbursement. So the facilitation of and funding for abortion services. Workforce, so the support and stabilization of California's abortion provider network to ensure that we have a robust network of providers throughout the state who are diverse and able to provide support to Californians and those who may come here. There was a working group around abortion funding and practical support, really thinking about the support, funding, and infrastructure necessary to ensure that people can actually access the abortion. There was a legal protections working group, which really focused on protections for abortion providers, patients, and those who support providers and patients. And there was a working group specifically on education, working to address misinformation, stigma, and research gaps that might have existed. So we worked, like I said, through those 5 work groups throughout the fall to put forth recommendations, which were then transformed into 13 bills in January and the beginning of this year. And those bills are slowly but surely making their way through the legislative process, as well as garnering support from the governor in his budget proposal and may revise. So that was really the impetus for the Future of Abortion Council, was recognizing that access was eroding in Texas, and we knew many other states would quickly follow. What can California do to be as ready as possible and as ahead of the game as possible? And so we really are kind of at the forefront in terms of being able to move a body of work of this size forward to ensure that abortion really is accessible here in the state. There are similar efforts that are occurring in other progressive states. We've seen action in Oregon. We've seen some municipal work in Chicago, Illinois, New York, Massachusetts, and other states are also taking action. But I will note that the California's Future of Abortion Council has the most comprehensive, I would say, set of proposals and the bill package itself in terms of really addressing abortion access issues as a holistic issue. We really acknowledge that we cannot move one of these recommendations without honestly moving all of them. We know that if folks can afford the abortion, they may not be able to afford the transportation or lodging necessary to actually access the abortion. We know that we need providers of all diversities and of all experience levels to be able to provide abortion in every corner of the state. And we know that they need to be protected from prosecution and from criminalization of any kind. So really understanding that these issues are very much intertwined and that we need to move this work as a full body of work has been really powerful. And I think I will stop there in terms of talking about how the FAB Council came together and what brings us to where we are now.
Perfect. So comprehensive and incredibly important work. Thank you. Doesn't even begin to describe how appreciative we are for your forward thinking and for all of you that have been part of this Future of Abortion Council. So let's hear a little bit more about the FAB from Lisa Matsubara, who's the General Counsel and Vice President of Policy at Planned Parenthood Affiliates of California, where she works on statewide public policy and legislative and regulatory advocacy focused on sexual and reproductive health care. Throughout her career, she's worked on a wide range of healthcare legislation and legal actions, including access to birth control and abortion services, public health, vaccines, telehealth, patient privacy, and more. She's a board member for Access Reproductive Justice. You're starting to see a thread here that we are all linked, importantly, and as are all of us joining on this call. So as a board member for Access Reproductive Justice, and as a former board member and a past president of the California Society for Healthcare Attorneys. So Lisa, thank you for joining us. And now that we have a sense for how the FAB was formed and what initiatives have been underway, what does the future of abortion plans look like in California? What decisions have been made? How were decisions made for the council? What does it really look like for California, especially in light of what's been happening?
Well, thank you. So I feel like I need to up my bio now. I actually am not a good plant mom. So my plant right here is actually fake, but you know, I'll be working on my bio for next time. But hi, thanks everyone. I am Lisa. I am the General Counsel and VP at Planned Parenthood Affiliates of California, where I oversee the legal policy and advocacy work on behalf of the 7 affiliates that operate in California. Our affiliates here operate over 100 health centers that serve patients every day. They do about a little over 1 million patient visits a year, and provide really comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care, including obviously a range of abortion services, as well as things like gender affirming care. As Nakia mentioned, also our organization is a member of CCRF, and we are also proud to sit on the steering committee for the California FAB Council with my co-panelists here. So I just want to start, thank you, Jessica, for giving like a really great overview of how the FAB Council work kind of came about and sort of the process by which we came up with the recommendations. I do want to just start as the lawyer, just to lay the groundwork a little bit about where we are right at this moment. This week, Oklahoma passed a ban that's very similar to the one in Texas. And, as Jessica mentioned, part of the impetus for us really getting together last fall was the fact that SB 8 in Texas, which really circumvents the existing legal mechanisms to stop states from doing things that are unconstitutional under Roe. They had this scheme where it's almost a bounty hunter scheme where the state's not enforcing the ban, but in fact, they're relying on private citizens to instead file private actions against abortion providers for providing the abortions. And so, we were pretty convinced that, at least I did not think that the Supreme Court was going to let this law go into effect in September. Obviously, completely wrong. The Supreme Court is hell-bent on making sure that abortion is banned. And so at this point, we realized that folks in Texas, we lost access to most abortions in the state overnight. We just saw that happen in Oklahoma as well, and this week. And so one by one, the constitutional protections under Roe, even though Roe is still the law of the land, are really not protecting folks or ensuring access to abortion in those states. And even before those actions, there has been so many restrictions in many of the states that it's been very difficult for folks to be able to actually access services that are close to where they live. And so, this action has been something that has been sort of decades long in the making. And I think in the last several years, they have been really emboldened to pass even more and more restrictive laws, more and more things that are obviously in direct conflict with the precedent under Roe. And this year alone, anti-abortion lawmakers have introduced over 500 restrictions in over 40 states. And as I said, with the Supreme Court about to overturn the longstanding precedent that has protected the right to abortion for almost 50 years, we are going to start to see pretty much, it's estimated that in the next few weeks, I guess now, over 36 million people in over half of the states are going to be losing access to abortion in their home state. At the same time, we're also seeing other kinds of efforts by anti-abortion lawmakers in other states to restrict access to things like medication abortion, particularly when it relates to being able to access those services via telehealth. And we're also seeing some states take a really aggressive approach to really attempt to ban residents from leaving their states to obtain an abortion. So that's something, that's sort of the backdrop by which, you know, we were doing the work of the California Fab Council, but also what is the impetus behind many of our legislative and advocacy efforts that are really going on right now. And I think, Frankie, I had a few slides. I don't know if you can screen share for me. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. If you can move to the next slides. I think Jessica covered many of these things. This is the steering committee of, if you can go back one slide, sorry. This is the steering committee of the California Fab Council. I do want to, mention the fact that we actually had a bill to remove cost sharing for abortion services in the legislature last year, and that failed to move forward, but was actually signed into law this year. But this was the core group of co-sponsors that worked on that bill. And, the one thing I do want to stress is that the participants and the members of the California Fab Council are folks that have been on the ground working on increasing access to abortion for decades. And so even though we are very lucky here in California to have really good legal protections in place, that has not necessarily meant that everyone in California has had really equitable access to abortion services. And, that's particularly true if you live in rural areas or you come from communities of color that, already face barriers to accessing healthcare in general, or, you are low income. So, we have been working to sort of address sort of these barriers to care at every level, whether it's at the regulatory stage with the Department of Healthcare Services that administers our Medi-Cal program, or at the statewide level with policies that, like the bill that I just mentioned before, which was to make sure that even folks who do have health insurance don't get hit with really high deductibles or out-of-pocket costs when they're trying to access abortion services. So a lot of the work that went into the Fab Council were not new ideas. They were things that were already kind of in the works. Next slide. So this is the work group. So I'm going to move on. If you can go kind of to that slide with all the bills on it. Next one. Okay. So the as Jessica mentioned, the legislature currently does have 13 bills that directly address the recommendations that came out of the Fab Council report. There are almost, those bills are accompanied by almost $200 million in budget asks to the state. And that's to make sure, was what I was just talking about, which is that it's not just the policies that get put into place, but the state is actually investing and providing resources to organizations that have been doing this work for a while, and making sure that the states, it's not that they're just able to do the work, but they actually have the resources to provide the assistance and build capacity to not just improve access to abortion in California, but to prepare for folks coming in from out of state. And so they kind of fall into these four buckets. There's the 4 bills that address cost barriers that I think Nakia already mentioned, the one that provides support for abortion funds and practical support. There's one that provides funding for uncompensated care, as folks coming in from out of state will likely not be able to use their insurance or will not qualify for our Medicaid program. We also have a series of bills regarding legal protections. Nakia mentioned 2223, which is to make sure that folks aren't criminalized for accessing abortion services. And then we have a series of bills that are aimed at protecting providers and patients here in California from any adverse sort of legal consequences that they may face if they're providing services to people who are coming in from out of state. We also have a series of bills to improve workforce. So those are 1918, as well as some efforts to expand the number of people who will be able to provide abortion services. And then really importantly, part of the health equity work, we want to make sure that folks have comprehensive, accurate, culturally relevant information with regards to abortion access here in the state. And so funding for community-based organizations like BWW Action Project to make sure that those folks have the ability to provide resources and people are not getting having to go somewhere and not being sure if they're actually getting the right information. And so making sure that there is funding for folks to really do the outreach that is necessary to people who are going to be seeking care here in California. And though it's not on this slide too, is that part of the FAB Council recommendations also do include things that are outside of the legislative process, including things that are like administrative in nature. So a group of us have been working really closely with our Medi-Cal program to ensure that there's increased access to telemab, so medication abortion through the use of telehealth, and to make sure that there isn't medically unnecessary requirements like ultrasounds in order for Medi-Cal patients to be able to access medication abortion. So I will stop there as my time's up, and happy to be around later for the panel.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's such incredibly thoughtful. I hope all of you are getting a sense for the sense of thoughtfulness that was put into this work, and how comprehensive it is, not only for Californians, but for the anticipation of those that will be coming to California needing care. So I'd like to turn now, as was just mentioned, about BWW. So that's short for Black Women for Wellness. So joining us is Onyemma Obiekea. Is it Obiekea? I want to make sure I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Obiekea.
Obiekea. Okay. And so Onyemma is the policy analyst for Black Women for Wellness and its sister organization, Black Women for Wellness Action Project. And Onyemma began her work in reproductive justice as a program coordinator for BWW's Get Smart Before You Get Sexy program, which sounds awesome. So it's the comprehensive sex and sexuality education program for the organization's reproductive justice focused project, Sisters in Control. And since then, she's continued her work in reproductive justice in various capacities and currently works on behalf of the BWW Action Project to advance intersectional, transformative legislation that seeks to secure the health and well-being of Black women and girls throughout California. And she claims that she needs to up her game in her bio, but I'll leave it at that. So thank you so much for joining us, Onyemma. And surely all of this work could not have been an easy pathway. So as we see now the result of this work and where things stand right now, thanks to your three colleagues, what have been some of the main challenges or pushbacks that the council has faced?
Yes, and thank you, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll just share a bit more about our organization. So I'm Onyemma, and Black Women for Wellness Action Project and Black Women for Wellness, we're statewide reproductive justice organizations based in Los Angeles, committed to improving the overall health status and well-being of Black women and girls. And we work to achieve this by building the political and electoral power of Black women throughout California. And so because we believe in a just and equitable future for Black women, we engage in policy and sponsor legislation that advances equity in that regard. And that's kind of how we find ourselves in these spaces as well, because we were the co-sponsors of SB 245, the bill that was recently passed that removed cost sharing for abortion access. And that's how we found ourselves in the FAB Council space. I have to also always recognize Nurbese Flint, who was the executive director and has been a force in the policy world. But so as Julie mentioned, I've been tasked with sharing the main controversies or challenges to the FAB Council in this entire process that we've experienced or received. And I honestly just have to start by saying that in doing this work, I'm deeply grateful to live in California, and I'm deeply like humbled, right? As the days go by and as the impact of the work of the Fab Council becomes more clear, like I'm humbled and grateful. And that's kind of my overwhelming feeling. And of course, proud to be a part of this work. Since Texas's SB 8, when the increasingly hostile reproductive health landscape was really just amplified, like, because RJ folks on the ground will tell you that we've been canaries in the coal mine, right? And we've been shouting that this would happen eventually. Since it was amplified and brought to the mainstream, we have been engaged in coalitions and conversations with partners across the nation. And to hear their stories and accounts of their struggle for reproductive freedom, it's just been devastating to hear, right? And I'll just take a moment to answer a question that I saw in the Q&A around what our organizations are doing to support what's going on in other states. I'll say that we're engaged in coalition work with other states that are taking cues from California and taking cues from the work of the Fab Council to do this work. Sorry, but I'll come back. I recognize that the landscape in California is different, and we have an overwhelmingly supportive legislature and political leadership. So barriers in the form of like politicians or lack of political will, like we witness in other states, is not necessarily present in California. The policymakers in our state have been engaged, and they've demonstrated their commitment to supporting abortion access and expanding it, and more specifically, supporting the mandate of the Fab Council. And they do that by taking their cues from the reproductive rights, health and justice advocates that make up the Fab Council. So that's been encouraging and that's been heartening. And the way I'm thinking about challenges, which was actually honestly kind of a struggle to find, right? Like to think through. I'd say that in thinking about timeline, right? The Fab Council, the idea of it came about in response to Texas's SB 8, right? So September, October, that time around, right? And we were tasked to come up with policy recommendations to move through the legislative cycle, right? So by the end of the year, we were tasked with coming up with these recommendations, right? Convening a body, right? And producing this work. And so that very short timeline was daunting, to say the least, right? Daunting probably at best. But, I want to recognize that the coalition of 40 organization comprised of a diverse group of experts. So you had social justice advocates, you had providers, you had legal experts, you had a diverse group of folks whose bread and butter was, who have been on the ground and who've worked in reproductive justice and or reproductive health and all of that. And they've come to the table to offer their insights and just be this phenomenal brain trust. And there were some critiques around developing recommendations in such a short amount of time and whether or not that work could truly be impactful, right? There were some legitimate concerns that were raised around how are we working within these kinds of systems, right? And what does it mean to come up with recommendations on such a short period of time? And we grappled with that, I think, as the Fab Council. We talked through it, but one thing that I think was important was to recognize that it was important to respond. Since the influx, since Texas's SB 8 was implemented or went into effect, California has seen folks coming to California to seek care. So one thing that was important was to ensure that California would be prepared and ready to accept and welcome the influx of folks that we anticipate will come should Roe fall, and the more than 26 states that have restricted abortion access in the way that they've done will lead folks here to seek care. I mean, the Guttmacher Institute estimates that California will see an estimated 3,000%, nearly 3,000% increase or uptick in folks and callers coming to the state to seek care. So I think it's important to note that, we had to respond. We had to respond, and we had to respond in a meaningful way. I think, we needed to move, and we needed to move quickly, right? Because just as we were moving quickly, states that were hostile towards abortion care were moving quickly. And we see every day, we hear news about how one state has topped another hostile state to pass some kind of egregious law, right? Even if it means vetoing a governor's, overriding a governor's veto. So it was imperative that we moved quickly. I think it's also important to note that the policy recommendations propose both short and long-term goals. And the charge of the council was to center equity in its work. And by its composition, everyone was challenged to do that. And the recommendations also contemplate the idea of contemplate equity and systems level change. So, by producing something in such a short period of time, I think the brain trust of folks that were in the space allowed for it to be to produce really robust recommendations. I want to say that it's critical to note too that, the work of the council continues. So, it does not stop at developing and presenting recommendations, right? It does not stop at the passage of 13 proposed bills. Lord, if policy work has taught me anything, it's that the real work happens at implementation. So we've got work to do once these are passed. And we know that there's work to be done in proposing additional policy recommendations that continue to move us to a state where abortion is not only like a right in name only, but one where it's equitably accessible for both those who come to the state and also those who are within the state who honestly don't necessarily all have access to care. So there's work to be done, and the work of the council continues. So it doesn't stop here. And I think that's a way to address like sort of challenges around like timeline. But I have to note that the work that was produced has influenced so many other states. Massachusetts is one state that has just produced recommendations based on the work that the FAB Council put forth. So we have really established ourselves in California as a leader in this work, a leader in how to think about expanding access to care in a way that centers equity, that centers people of color, that centers the needs of all communities in this fight. I'll say that the 13 bills that were advanced, I think was where the real pushback and controversy came. And I might be wrong, but this is where I really noticed it. Perhaps because this gave anti-choice folks something tangible to organize around, to create narratives around, to disseminate misinformation around, and mobilize around. So that was a challenge in another way that I think we're seeing. And so while we've had, we'll be up at the Capitol advocating on behalf of our bills, maybe providing testimony for the different bills. And, they'll say, anti-choice folks have descended on the Capitol and taking up tremendous amount of space, right? And so, they're taking up space in newspaper headlines and trying to change narratives there. And so, I think once the legislative package was proposed, we then saw public, the anti-choice really were able to sort of galvanize their bases and mobilize in a way that I think they didn't know what to do with when they didn't understand what the council was and the power and the influence of what this body has become. They didn't have an idea of what they didn't know what to do with it in the beginning, right? But now it's clear that honestly, the council and the steering committee have proven to be a force. And I think now the antis are out. So I think those are some of the challenges. I know I talked more about encouraging things because that's how I can think about it, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much. I think you appropriately addressed that question and the implications of this work. So thank you so much. And we'll have time to hear more from you during the Q&A session. So we'll turn now to Shannon Olivieri Hovis, who's a policy expert and a political strategist who spent her career fighting for civil and human rights with nearly 15 years of experience as a change maker in the state and local governments, in the classrooms and electoral campaigns and mission-driven advocacy. She joined NARAL Pro-Choice America in July 2018 and became the director of the NARAL Pro-Choice California in April 2019. And under her leadership, NARAL Pro-Choice California has co-sponsored and passed pivotal legislation, including in 2021, SB 65 to close racial disparities in maternal and infant mortality and morbidity, and in 2020, in SB 1383 to expand job protection, paid family leave to an additional 6 million Californians, among many other pieces of legislation. So Shannon, thank you for joining us. And we'd like to just talk a little bit about, we've heard the legislative package, but anything else around, the main achievements and or what the future might be with Roe v. Wade most likely being overturned? What does this look like?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Thanks for the introduction. Hi, everybody. Shannon Olivieri, Hovis, Director of NARAL, Portuguese, California. So I'll just back up a little bit. NARAL, for folks who are not aware of our organization, we are the oldest and largest abortion rights advocacy organization in the country. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary a couple of years ago. And we're slightly older than Roe v. Wade. And we are powered by our membership. We have more than 2.5 million members nationally, and just about 300,000 members here in the state of California. And here in California, we're actually a really, really small but mighty team. I have 2 organizers on the ground, myself, and then a cross-departmental team that's based in our DC office. We fight for reproductive freedom for all people. And I guess I will say for me, that means the ability to make personal, individual decisions about our reproductive lives and futures, free from any form of oppression and free from government interference. And we are fighting for those things across the board. I think, we've talked a lot about the work of the FAB Council, and I'll give you, I'll touch on that for a second, but first I'll zoom out a bit to what is going on with the national landscape and what we expect to come down. So the draft majority opinion obviously was a couple, we expect the final opinion out in the next couple weeks, likely by June, possibly the first week of July. It is clear that the Supreme Court is poised to overturn Roe v. Wade. The exact substance of the exact language of the majority opinion could change, but we know that the votes have not changed, at least not as of this time. So it's not surprising, right? Trump and the anti-choice machine have been striving for this for literally decades. They found a mainstream voice and advocate in Donald Trump, and he helped them get a 6-3 anti-choice majority on the Supreme Court. So as others have indicated, this isn't, where we are is not surprising. It's also not something that they've just flipped able to do overnight. This is something that they have been really strategic about engaging in, the anti-choice machine, as I would call it. They are very small, very vocal, and very well-funded minority, but they have been able to take hold, obviously, across the country. So we expect the ruling to come down. We expect Roe to fall. And obviously that's hard for all of us to swallow. I think when the draft opinion came out, it was, even for those of us who've been working on this for many years, it was still shocking, astonishing. I feel like that night I had to sit with it for an hour, and then I had to kick my butt into gear because obviously there was work to be done, and lots of folks in the media wanted to talk to all of us about what the future was going to look like. It is dire. We do expect, our latest numbers show that 28 states are likely to criminalize abortion entirely or almost entirely within their states. And there are 13 states that have trigger bans on the books. So as soon as Roe falls, those bans go into effect in those states. The 36 million women of reproductive age, that's going to be an undercount in all likelihood. And that, as Nakia rightly pointed to earlier on, doesn't include all people who will need access to abortion care and don't identify as women. I think, and for the role of California, we need to really recognize that California already plays a hugely significant role in providing abortion care. In fact, more than a quarter of healthcare facilities that provide abortion care in the entire country are currently located in California. Our most recent data shows that 17% of abortions provided in the entire country happen in California. So we already play this outsized role, and you can imagine how that exponentially ballooned as states lose the right to abortion care. So I lost my train of thought. So yes, so obviously a lot of emphasize, a lot of people still talk about a post-Roe world as if it will resemble a pre-Roe.
Shannon, did we lose you? I think we did. Okay. So hopefully she will join us, be able to rejoin us. Incredibly important information about the implication for California and certainly for the rest of the state. So now that you've heard from all of our panelists, let's transition to your questions. People have been dropping them in the Q&A. And for those panelists who've been able to answer the questions as they come up, that's terrific. I think one of the things that I just like to start by asking all of the panelists, and then I'll turn to our questions, is we have individuals that are on this call that want to lean in and get involved right now. So what specifically do you need to support your efforts, either in California or among the coalition members and partners throughout the country? So I'd like to just offer it to each of our panelists to share a little bit about what can people do to lean into this in a really meaningful way right now.
I can start. So, I mean, I think, I can tell you all of the regular things, right? Like donate, donate to Access, that is our statewide abortion fund. Donate to abortion funds in other states where access is very limited. But I think the main thing that everybody can do is really to do their part to destigmatize abortion. That is something that folks like at We Testify, who run an abortion storyteller program, have really done, and have really uplifted voices of folks who've had abortions. 1 in 4 people of reproductive age, like who are able to get pregnant, have an abortion during their lifetime in America. It is extremely common. People have abortions all the time. People are going to continue to have abortions. None of these bans are going to stop that. Abortion is healthcare, and we've had, part of, I think, the part of the reason why we've gotten to this point too is that folks have always been afraid to talk about it, and they feel shame, and that's something that you shouldn't talk about, something that you should, keep a secret. And that has made it easier for people to put all these restrictions in place. And so I don't want anyone to have to share their story if they feel uncomfortable. But if you feel comfortable and empowered, know that you're not alone, and that a lot of people have abortions. And the more people speak out about their experiences, the more destigmatized it gets. And that is, I think, my plea is really to people need to say it. They need to say abortion. They need to talk about it, and share their stories.
Right. Thank you, Lisa. Any other comments? So Shannon's back, which we're glad to have you back, Shannon. But I posed the first question to all of our panelists, which is, what are some very tangible things that individuals can do right now to really lean into this in a meaningful way? And Lisa kicked off the discussion as part of that. So Onyemma, Jessica, Nakia, Shannon, anything that you'd like to offer?
Yeah, I would just jump in and say 100% agree with Lisa. Anything we can do to destigmatize abortion is absolutely necessary in this moment. I will also just make a plug for Access Reproductive Justice, which is the state's only statewide standalone abortion fund. And we have already been seeing an increase in callers throughout the course of 2022 and anticipate only growing caller numbers in the coming months, as well as increased barriers for those who are trying to access care. So if you are in California and interested in supporting Access, we strongly encourage you to volunteer. We do connect volunteers with our callers to provide transportation, to provide housing, to provide financial support. And I will drop a link, assuming that my internet wants to work, in the chat momentarily for where you can sign up if you're interested in being a volunteer. And then of course, please donate. Our abortion fund our health line is essentially entirely run off of individual donations. So literally every $5, $10 donation actually does make a huge difference in making sure that we can provide support to folks who need help paying for an abortion, need help with transportation, with lodging, with childcare, food, whatever the need may be. And I will just put a plug in that we are in our last few days of fundraising for our annual fundathon. Our goal is to raise $100,000 and we're getting closer and closer by the minute. So if you donate between now and the end of May 31st, you actually get enrolled in a really awesome giveaway. Our fundathon this year is reading themed, and so it's a private bookstore shopping experience. So please support however you can. And again, I can't reiterate enough what Lisa was saying around saying the word abortion, doing what you can to destigmatize where you can.
Great, thank you so much. Onyemma or Nakia, anything you'd like to add before I jump back to Shannon to just for her closing remarks, and then I'm going to turn to our Q&A that have been posed.
Yeah. Yeah, just really quick. And I seen there's a question in the chat about like employment and opportunities and all those things. One, donating to us is great because most of our organizations are staffed, like California Coalition for Reproductive Freedom. We have 2 staff members. And a lot of our grassroots organizations, when we're talking about donating, we're not talking about necessarily to large scale orgs that have resources. We're talking about grassroots, and then also to go along with making sure that you're sharing your stories about the abortions that you've had, the abortions that, with consent that your loved ones have had. Also most folks in this country just don't have a basic understanding of how reproduction actually works, which is how most of these laws come into play, and if they had an idea of how reproduction and reproductive cycles actually work, my hope is that laws would look different. So doing whatever you can to educate yourselves and your peers. You have a big following on TikTok, share that story, because in California we're lucky to be, we have these privileges to learn about sexual education and things like that. In other places we don't. But shout out to the internet, we're able to share our stories, share our voices, and make sure as many folks are educated as possible.
Great, thank you so much. Onyemma, anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I'd add quick. So I'd echo everything that everyone else has said. The sharing the stories pieces, particularly within communities that, the topic of abortion can be taboo, is critically important to hear from your trusted sort of family members and loved ones, just only because that resonates with me, because internally we've been talking about this and we've been hearing about how, these stories have come to be and how we've held space for folks to share their stories, stories of folks, anyway, to share stories. So sharing stories to reduce stigma is critical. I agree with that. That resonates so much with me. But I also think plugging into, organizations to just be in the know, right? So for instance, we are advancing policy and legislation and pieces of legislation, right? So plugging into various advocacy organizations such that you can engage in the process when, a bill is about to be heard in a policy committee, right? And we need folks to call in to say, call in and give a Me Too, right, in support of a bill. That's one thing that you can, one concrete thing that you can do to, for instance, support the advancement of these bills, right? Following these organizations on social media such that you can amplify the messages, right? So when we tweet at our legislators, you can also show your support by retweeting or amplifying that message, right? And tweeting your legislators. So and I think you can do that and you become in the know of all the opportunities to sort of engage by signing up with the NARALs, the Black Women for Wellness Action Projects, the PPACs, just signing up to be on our listservs so you can be informed and know when action is necessary, right? If you want to be engaged in that way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, because advocacy is not a spectator sport. That's what it is. Advocacy is not a spectator sport. All right. So with that, we've got Shannon that's joined us, and I think I saw a beautiful little baby on her lap. So maybe you're able to offer your last couple of comments, Shannon, before we open it up to some additional questions that have been posed in the Q&A. And I did see that there was a question around opportunities for employment, and I think that Jessica responded to that. So feel free, please, Shannon, to continue your train of thought. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? I might just stay
Yes.
off camera so to try to save my internet.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. So yes, my 6-month-old Catalina, she just woke up from her nap and I needed to hand her off. So what I was in the middle of saying was, I do want us to be mindful about how we talk about a post-Roe world compared to a pre-Roe world. People hearken to these images of, the coat hangers and those kinds of things and say, we won't go back to coat hangers. And I think all of us on this, on this panel would say, please don't use that kind of imagery right now. Really a post-Roe world, the fear for us, I mean, it's multifaceted, but one piece of it is that the post-Roe world actually looks like women and pregnant people hands rather than the sort of coat hanger imagery. And what I mean by that is we are seeing, obviously, the impulse to criminalize abortion care and really pregnancy outcomes in general on the rise all across the country. And it's happening for decades. It's important for folks to know that in the last 2 decades, at least 1,300 people have been criminally prosecuted in the United States for miscarriages, stillbirths, and for self-managing their own abortion. But there is, and then even here in California, and that's why we're running one of the bills this year, AB 2223, to ensure nobody is criminally prosecuted or even investigated for any pregnancy outcome. Because even here in California, we've had 2 women recently prosecuted for experiencing stillbirths. Again, the impulse is on the rise all across this country. So that is something that we are very mindful of. How do we, and what we have seen from many other states or many other countries that are extremely repressive in these ways is that, again, people end up incarcerated for experiencing miscarriages, any kind of adverse pregnancy outcome that you can't sufficiently explain away comes back. And that is a really scary world to be living in. So I do, and then of course, I want to emphasize that we have safe ways to manage your own abortion these days. So medication abortion is extremely safe, can be in a home, and it can be bought online. So you asked, what are some things that people can be doing? And I guess I'd have a few recommendations. One is get medication abortion. Don't hoard it. None of this like pandemic stuff, but get it. Have it in your medicine cabinet. If you need it, if I need it, you're prepared. That is one thing that we can all concretely do. It is the case that many states that plan to ban abortion or trying to ban abortion now will also have bans on telehealth or are instating bans on telehealth. So, the sooner the better that we have that on hand. Tell our friends all across the country to have that on hand. It's a good thing to do. Remember that we are the majority. We are actually the super majority. 8 in 10 Americans support the legal right to abortion. That is regardless of whether they would choose abortion for themselves or not. 8 in 10 is not just a majority, it's truly a consensus. So we should act like the majority. And that means voting with our power. And I don't just mean voting. I mean, the midterms are coming. There is not a single state in the country in which bans on abortion are popular. So we need to be active across the board. We need to be active here in California. We need to help maintain the House, right? We have the majority in the House right now. We need to maintain that by reelecting folks like Katie Porter and all of those kinds of things. NARAL is a political organization, so I'm going to speak to some of the political stuff. We also have an opportunity to actually gain ground in the US Senate. And there is federal legislation, the Women's Health Protection Act, which would enshrine a federal right to abortion all across this country. So even if Roe falls as a constitutional right by this anti-choice Supreme Court, we would still have a federal right with the Women's Health Protection Act. But we need numbers. We need better numbers, and we need to hold these anti-choice legislators to account for what they're doing. So that is a big piece. It is always the case that an election is coming, our opportunity to make waves, and we need to be doing that in big ways. And then, of course, volunteer with us, like help us pass this legislative package. The last piece I was supposed to talk about was achievements. Well, this week, all 13 future Abortion Council bills passed out of their first house, and they're on to their second house. So the entire package that we are working on is still moving. That's a huge accomplishment and something to be really proud of. And as Jessica pointed out, you can't part and parcel this. This is a comprehensive package. It is intertwined and everything connects to one another. So we need the full package, and we are pushing for the full package very hard. So I would say, it is, the last thing I'll say is things are going to get worse before they get better, but have faith in public opinion. The people are on our side, and progress is not linear. Every era of progress is followed by an era of backlash. We have seen that time and again, and we just need to keep fighting to move the needle forward. We are going to lose ground in states, but we have to do everything we can to hold them to account and flip state legislatures, flip state governors' offices, and reclaim those states one at a time. And once people start voting on this issue because we don't want our rights taken away, we could see some really powerful things happen all across the country. So I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you so much, Shannon. I'm so glad you were able to join us and elucidate those calls to action. So I'm going to turn now to the Q&As that have been, or the questions that have been posed in our Q&A opportunity in the little chat box. So there's the chat and then there's the Q&A. And some of our panelists have been answering those questions, or other people have been answering individual questions, which is terrific. If you feel as though you have a meaningful response to be able to offer, I would encourage you to go ahead and do that. I'm going to turn to by order of in which they were first presented. So one of our first questions was asking if the California Fab Council at some point is giving consideration to making a recommendation that California remove the viability cutoff, which would allow for serving a wider range of patients similar to New Mexico or Colorado. So I'll just kind of ask anyone to address that before we move to the next one around telehealth.
I can jump in on this one. It is something that has been discussed within the Future of Abortion Council and in other spaces. I will just note it's a little bit of a harder nut to crack, and there's a wide range of opinions on this particular issue. And so I think it's certainly something that, folks are open to conversation about, but there's not necessarily collective agreement in the movement around that. So yeah, I think it's something that we would continue to have conversation about, both within the Fab Council as well as in our broader movement spaces. But it's complicated for providers. I'm not a provider, so I'm not even going to get into that.
Sure.
But it's certainly something that would benefit patients, and we know and understand that. So something we're open to further conversation about.
Great. Thank you so much for answering that question. So let's now turn to telehealth and how telehealth care could be affected by states that have plans to ban abortion. Several of you have mentioned the role that telehealth plays, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
I can jump in on telehealth issues. So in general, there are a few states that do have interstate licensure compacts where providers in some states can provide telehealth services to those in other states. And this is even just outside the abortion context as well. However, in general, you do have to be licensed in the state that the patient is in order to provide telehealth services. I do think that there are some like very specific laws that are being passed in some of these states that are directly aimed at preventing the provision of medication abortion through the use of telehealth, even within that state, or even if the providers are licensed to practice in those states. So that makes it very difficult. And we have, I think, about 19 states at this point that have some sort of restriction on the provision of medication abortion through the use of telehealth. So it is something that I think has a lot of potential to really increase access to abortion services across the country, but also very difficult when the states are specifically passing laws aimed to prohibit that action. And then the one other thing I'd like to point out is that medication abortion traditionally has been very difficult to do via telehealth because of the federal restrictions. And there has been a recent change by the administration by the FDA to get rid of what we used to call the in-clinic dispensing requirement. So it does allow now at the federal level to be able to get medication abortion pills through the mail. So that's a positive sort of development in sort of the provision of abortion services through the use of telehealth.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisa. Let's go and answer or ask or have time to chat a little bit about activism and that as protests. So there's a question that asks, are there any protests that are happening soon around California, elsewhere? Any opportunities to join groups and really be publicly engaged in this from the activism standpoint?
I can start us off. There were a ton of actions that have been happening over the last couple of weeks. So that's great. I think the other thing is to always remind folks that there's more than one way to be an activist. Protesting, especially for Black people, folks of color, is not safe because we will be the first people arrested at the protest. And so like that is sometimes not an option for us. We also just want to remind folks of protest safety. Like again, we do not necessarily organize protests. We might organize rallies and webinars, but just again, recognizing people's safety. We just want to make sure that folks are doing what they need to do. The activism also looks like calling our legislatures. It looks like, you know, that people make fun of social media activists, but again, social media is one of the ways that we learn so much. So, you know, encouraging your friends, your family members to make social media posts, to make stands are some of the ways that I think about activism. That's not necessarily the traditional, like we're gonna go to a protest and shut shit down. You can also, you know, partner with organizations that you know already hold protests so that they can support you in hosting safe protests. I don't know if other folks have answers to that question.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Nakia. Really, really helpful. Okay. So let's go ahead and address Anne's question, which is, what are the crisis communication experts advising in terms of destigmatizing abortion? And she offers that her sense is that some of the arguments are that people will still get abortions are not working. So how do we build on privacy and personal control of one's body, regardless of what, you know, an individual chooses, some of those kinds of things. So around destigmatization, particularly in light of the call to message around people if they feel comfortable.
I'll start us off, but one of y'all also has to answer. So I just want to make sure that I'm answering this right. One, like, consent is always important. Nobody needs to do anything that they don't feel comfortable with. We also want to just encourage people to make sure that they are safe when they are sharing their stories, understanding that if you are in a state where abortion has become illegal, is legal, there's a lot of stigma. It may be unsafe for you to share your abortion story. Something to remember is that you don't always have to share your face with your abortion story. You can tell your truth without being put in harm's way. And then also becoming involved in, I can't remember the name of one of y'all shared an organization that is doing work on doing storytelling. That's another way that you can, again, share your story without you becoming a target, again, without you being, oh yeah, We Testify, without you being feeling like you're unsafe. And thank you, Lisa, for putting that in the chat for everyone. And then again, for folks that are in states like California, where we, you know, abortion is it's going to be safe here. That's what we've decided. You can, you know, feel free to again share your story with your face and your name if it is safe for you to do so.
Thank you so much for offering that, Nakia. So one last question, and then I'm going to ask everyone to have a closing statement. So this person offers in the chat or in the question that is a California resident moving to New Jersey soon. And are any of our panelists familiar with reproductive justice organizations that they could get involved with in New Jersey?
Yeah, there's definitely an abortion fund in New Jersey. I believe it's the New Jersey Abortion Access Fund. That might be an opportunity. I am not sure off the top of my head if they have volunteers. I think that they probably do. So yeah, your local abortion fund is always always a good place to start.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay. So I'd just like to turn to all of our panelists one more time, allow for you to make one closing statement that you'd like people to leave this webinar with, and then we'll thank all of you again as part of being here. So maybe we can go in reverse order, starting with Shannon, and then we'll work backwards from there. So Shannon, and then Onyemma, Lisa, Jessica, and we'll close with Nakia. You'll be our closer, Nakia. All right. So Shannon, please, any closing statement that you'd love?
Thanks, Julie. I think my biggest statement is simply, I know that this is a really discouraging time, and you know, and many of us feel really devastated by what's going on. It is, you know, obviously it's abortion and women's rights, but it's LGBTQ rights. This is super tied to what's going on transgender folks around the country. It's very tied to what's going on with attacks on voting rights across the country. I would view all of these issues as interconnected. These are racial justice, gender justice, economic justice issues, threats to our democracy. We don't have the luxury of just sort of like, I mean, Julie says that you know, being an activist is not a spectator sport, and beyond that, even, we just don't have the luxury of getting so like dark on things, like that things are so dire that we can't actually act. We have to recognize that California is doing incredible work right now. Join us, feel inspired by that work. It will uplift you. California is not alone. There are many other states that are doing this too. And so I just would encourage you. I think that the closer you get to these fights, the more momentum you will feel, as far as, you know, we are not going down. We are not going down without a fight. We are doing incredible work, and we are going to continue to ensure that people can access the critical healthcare that they need all across this country, no matter what that looks like. So I would just, that's my rallying call is join us, get involved. It's dark, but it's not that dark. There's a lot of light out there. So join us.
Thank you so much. Onyemma, and then we'll turn to Lisa. So last thoughts.
last thoughts, and thank you again for calling together this group of folks and putting together this phenomenal panel. I don't have much else to add that's profound or anything like that, but I do want to just say, be encouraged, be engaged. There's work to be done, and there is room for each and every one of us on these calls to contribute to the work that needs to be done. You know, someone talked about the amount of time, patience, like time in terms of years, persistence and perseverance and sort of creativity that it took, you know, to chip away at Roe, right? To get to the point that, you know, that we're at now, right? Like to get to the place that we're anticipating, you know, the fall of Roe. That also means though that like it took a long time. It took years, it took patience, it took strategy, right? And that's what it's going to take of us on this side of the wall to fight. And so even if the fight might be long, the fight is winnable, and it's winnable in a way that we can maybe win something that is even better than Roe, right? We can reimagine, like, you know, we can reimagine a landscape, a reproductive justice landscape, and rebuild the landscape to one that really truly is equitable, inclusive, and contemplates the rights of all people, right, on all spectrums, and can be a bit more, can be stronger, or, you know, fortified. So the fight can be long and hard, and it will require some patience and some persistence and some perseverance, but it is a winnable fight. And everyone has a place to, there is space for everyone to plug in with their expertise, with their time, from wherever they are, to sort of win this fight, you know, as we move ahead. So that's all.
Thank you so much. So inspiring. Lisa.
Well, I just want to say, like, I'm so grateful for my co-panelists, because we've been in community work doing this work on the ground, and I just respect and am so grateful for all of you. But just really keeping it real simple, like, we are going to continue to provide abortions here in California, and as a state, we have committed to making sure that everyone can come here to get the care that they need and deserve. And so I just want people to understand and know that we're committed to do that here in California.
Thank you, Lisa. Let's move to Jessica and then Nakia.
I would just echo everything that's already been said, and probably everything that's about to be said by Nakia. And we'll just say, you know, find your local abortion fund, support your local abortion fund. We have been on the ground preparing for this very moment for years, if not decades. We're equipped to help people move from state to state as needed and to get the full range of supports they need. And we're doing this so collaboratively, both with abortion funds in other states, as well as with our partner organizations in California. And yeah, everyone has a role to play, whether it's donating, volunteering, getting out in the streets, you know, sharing your abortion story. There's something that everyone can do in this moment, and just really ask you to jump in where you can.
Thank you so much. And Nakia, final thoughts.
I didn't realize that me going last meant I was last. It didn't click in my mind. But thank you. I just want to say thank you to everyone that showed up, and thank you for the amazing panelists, and for the folks that put this together. Just final thoughts. Just remember, y'all, when we're talking about abortion and we're talking about abortion access, we have to remember to put those that are on the margins of the margins at the center. We need to make sure that we're centering young folks, trans folks, folks of colors, poor folks, folks that are in the intersections of those identities. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about abortion access, you know, people with money will always have abortion to access. Will always have access to abortion. It's the rest of us who are going to have to fight and claw our way out. This is going to be a long struggle, a long fight, but I'm confident, maybe a little bit too confident, that in my lifetime, we will see abortion be legal in all 50 states, as it should be. And I'm going to say it here and now, speaking into existence.
Exactly. I was just going to say that. That's how I was going to end, with speaking into existence. I'm so glad that you are reading my thoughts. So thank you so much. All right, so thank you, panelists. Again, we so appreciate your time. We know that it's a long weekend. Thank you to the Bixby Center for hosting this incredibly important panel. Thank you to Frankie, and thank you to Dr. Tavro for hosting this. We will follow up, certainly. Again, advocacy is not a spectator sport. Got an opportunity to join the listserv. Got an opportunity to follow on Insta. Got an opportunity to have a call to action for volunteer, for donations, all those other kinds of things. Every single person on this call has time and talents and treasures that can be added to this. So we need you right now more than ever. All right. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and step away. Thank you so much to everyone, and happy, safe weekend. All right. Thanks, everyone.